I saw them before they rang the bell. The camera on my phone buzzed once on the kitchen counter, and I glanced down without thinking, expecting nothing more than a motion alert from the wind. Instead, I saw a woman standing on my porch with a child pressed against her side, the hood of his jacket pulled too tight around his face. Snow came down sideways, thick and fast, driven by gusts that shook the porch railing. The street behind them was already dark, the power out across most of the block. I did not need the radio to tell me how bad it was, but it was on anyway, murmuring warnings about wind chill and closed shelters and emergency lines stretched thin. I stood there in my warm kitchen holding my phone and watching them on a screen like they were part of another world. The woman shifted her weight, lifting the child slightly higher on her hip, and I noticed his hands red and bare, the fingers stiff and curled as if he had forgotten how to open them. She reached for the doorbell, hesitated, then pressed it once. The sound echoed inside my house, sharp and accusing. I did not move. I waited for it to stop. I told myself I needed more information, that it was safer to stay where I was until I understood the situation. I told myself a lot of things in the space of a few seconds. Then I did something worse. I reached up and turned off the porch light. The small pool of yellow warmth vanished, and the woman flinched slightly, looking up at the darkened fixture. From the camera, I could see her face, now tired, older than it should have been. Her lips moving as she said something to the child, probably telling him it was fine, that maybe no one was home. She did not knock again right away. She pulled the child closer and bent her head to shield his face from the wind. I felt a tightening in my chest that I tried to ignore. Turning off the light was easier than opening the door. It created distance. It let me pretend I had not seen them clearly. The radio crackled again, reminding anyone listening that exposed skin could freeze in minutes. I turned it down, but not off. On the screen, the child shifted and looked up directly into the camera lens. Not around it, not at the door, but straight at the small dark circle that I knew was watching him. His face was pale, his nose pink with cold, and his eyes were very steady. He did not cry. He did not wave. He just looked, and then he spoke. I could not hear his voice through the camera, but I read his lips easily because the words were slow and careful. "Mommy says knocking is what brave people do." The woman froze when he spoke, her eyes snapping up toward the door as if she were afraid he had said too much. She whispered his name and shook her head, but he kept looking at the camera, waiting. Something inside me cracked open in a quiet, unpleasant way. I had been telling myself a story about safety and caution, but that sentence had nothing to do with either. It was not a request or a plea. It was a statement about courage and standing still when it would be easier to walk away. The wind howled loud enough that I could hear it through the walls, and the camera shook slightly as a gust hit the porch. The woman finally knocked again, softer this time, almost apologetic. I looked around my kitchen at the solid walls, the working heat, the mug of coffee still warm in my hand. I thought about how easy it would be to stay exactly where I was. I thought about how no one would know. Then I thought about the way the child had looked straight into the lens as if he understood something about watching and being watched. I walked to the front door, slowly feeling the weight of each step. I did not turn the light back on. I did not call out. I reached for the door and slid the chain into place, keeping it locked while allowing it to open a few inches. My hand rested on the knob for a long moment. Through the narrow gap, I could already feel the cold pressing in, eager and sharp. I took a breath and opened the door just enough for them to see me, but not enough for them to step inside. The woman straightened immediately, her body tense, protective. The child leaned forward, curious, unafraid. I stood there holding the door with the chain still tight, knowing that whatever happened next would be different from the life I had chosen a few minutes earlier. I kept the chain on and opened the door only as wide as it would allow the cold spilling in immediately, sharp and unforgiving, like it had been waiting its turn. The woman noticed the chain at once and nodded as if she had expected it, her shoulders easing just a fraction in recognition of a boundary clearly stated. She did not step forward. She did not ask to come in. She adjusted her grip on the child and said thank you for answering, her voice steady but tight, the way people sound when they have practiced being calm. The child leaned closer, peering through the narrow opening at my face, his eyes moving slowly as if he were taking inventory of me. He was younger than I had thought, maybe 5 or 6, his cheeks raw from the wind, a smear of something dark near his sleeve where snow and dirt had mixed. I asked if they were all right, and the question sounded thin even to my own ears. The woman said they were fine in the way people say fine when it is the only word they have left. She explained quickly that their door down the street would not close properly, the frame warped from age and cold, and that the wind kept pushing it open. She said she had tried towels and tape and even a chair wedged under the handle, but nothing held. She spoke without drama, without asking for anything more than to be heard. While she talked, the child kept watching me, not my house or the warmth behind me, but my face. I could feel his attention like a hand on my sleeve. When she finished, there was a pause long enough for the wind to rush in and out between us. I was still deciding what to say when the child spoke again. "Do you get scared at night?" he asked, his voice clear and curious, not accusing. The woman stiffened immediately and apologized, saying he talked too much, that he asked questions of everyone. I shook my head before she could finish and told her it was fine. The truth was, the question had landed somewhere unexpected. I had been afraid of many things at night over the years, but none of them felt appropriate to explain to a child standing barefoot on my porch. I told him sometimes I did, and he considered that answer carefully, as if weighing it against something he already knew. He nodded once satisfied and then asked if my door ever got stuck. I glanced back at the solid frame behind me and said no, it worked fine. He frowned slightly, not in envy, but in concentration, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that involved doors and weather and adults who made choices. The woman glanced down at her phone, checking the screen, her thumb hovering over it before she slipped it back into her pocket. She told me quietly that there were no open warming centers left nearby, that the one at the school had closed early when the power went out. She said she had called the non-emergency line, but they told her to shelter in place if possible. Her mouth tightened when she said, if possible. I realized then that she was not asking me to fix anything or to let them in. She was explaining why they were still outside. The child pressed his small hand against the edge of the door, feeling the cold metal, and pulled it back quickly, shaking his fingers. He laughed once short and surprised, then tucked his hand under his arm the way children do when they are pretending not to be uncomfortable. "Mommy, he said our door sounds like it is crying when the wind pushes it." The woman closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. I could see the exhaustion in her face, the careful restraint of someone who had learned not to hope too quickly. I told them to wait and closed the door gently, keeping the chain on. I heard the child ask if that meant yes, and the woman answered that it meant we were waiting. I stood there with my back against the door, breathing in the warm air of my house and realizing how loud the silence felt. I had not said yes or no. I had bought time, which felt like another kind of avoidance. I grabbed my coat and a flashlight and returned to the door, opening it again to the same narrow width. I told her I could take a look at the door from the outside, nothing more, that I would not come in and that we would keep the camera on. She nodded immediately, relief crossing her face, not gratitude, just acceptance of a practical solution. The child smiled up at me wide and sudden, as if this had been the answer all along. As they turned away from my porch heading back into the storm, the child looked over his shoulder at me and said, "Thank you for not being scared alone." The words followed me as I stepped out into the cold, locking the door behind me and realizing that whatever I was doing now, I was no longer pretending not to be part of it. The wind had picked up while we walked back toward their place, and every few steps, the child stumbled slightly, not from weakness, but from trying to match his mother's longer stride. She slowed immediately each time, without thinking, her hand tightening around his. I stayed a step behind, keeping enough distance to feel respectful, but close enough that my presence meant something practical. Their building was older than my house by decades, the wood swollen and cracked from years of weather, the porch light flickering weakly like it was deciding whether to give up. The door was exactly as she had described. The frame bowed just enough that the latch caught only when the wind paused, and even then it sounded strained. I knelt down to examine it and felt the cold bite through my jeans instantly. The child crouched beside me, watching closely, his breath puffing out in small white clouds. "Mommy," he whispered, "do you think he can hear the door when it cries?" She brushed his hair back and told him to stand closer to the wall where the wind was less sharp. I pressed the flashlight beam along the frame and could see where the wood had pulled away just enough to invite the storm inside. It was not a complicated fix, but it was not something I could solve in minutes either, not with the tools I had. I stood and told her honestly that I could brace it for the night, maybe stop the wind from pushing it open, but it would not be a real repair. She nodded immediately and said that was enough for tonight, that tonight was all they were trying to get through. The child looked between us and asked where I lived, and when I pointed back down the street, he squinted into the dark and said it was far, but not too far. I smiled despite myself and began wedging a piece of scrap wood I found nearby into the lower corner, using my weight to push it into place. The door resisted at first, then settled closing with a dull, heavy sound that felt more like resignation than security. We all listened as the wind hit again, and this time the door held. The woman let out a breath she had clearly been holding for a long time. "Thank you," she said simply, and I nodded because anything more would have felt false. I stepped back, ready to leave, and that was when the radio from inside the house crackled to life through the thin walls, a weather alert cutting through the quiet. Wind chill dropping further emergency services, delayed stay indoors if possible. The words hung between us heavier than the cold. She looked at me, and for the first time there was something like a question in her eyes, though she did not ask it. The child leaned against her leg, suddenly tired, the adrenaline gone. I realized then that my silence was not neutral. I had fixed the door enough to keep them inside, but I had not made anything easier beyond that moment. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, listening to the wind and feeling the weight of what came next settle in my chest. If I left now, I could tell myself I had helped. I could go back to my warm house and let the night finish without me. If I stayed, if I said anything more, I would be choosing a direction that did not have a clear end. The woman shifted her weight and thanked me again, saying they would be all right now that the door held. She was giving me an exit, and I could see the effort it took. The child looked up at me again and asked if the wind ever listened when grown-ups told it to stop. I shook my head and said no, but sometimes doors did. He seemed satisfied by that answer and leaned his head against his mother's coat. I took a step back, then another feeling the pull of my own porch light waiting for me down the street. I told myself I had done enough. I told myself they were safer now. I told myself that staying quiet was the same as staying out of the way. None of it felt true. I heard my own voice before I fully decided to use it, asking her what their plan was if the door failed again. She hesitated just long enough to answer honestly and said she did not have one. The shelters were closed, her phone battery was low, and walking anywhere else in this weather with a tired child would be dangerous. She said it without accusation, without expectation. The truth landed hard and clean. Silence would not protect anyone here, not them and not me. I nodded slowly and said I would be back in a few minutes, that I needed to grab something. Her eyes widened slightly, not with hope, but with caution, the kind that comes from too many false starts. She thanked me again, but I could hear the restraint in her voice, the way she kept herself from leaning into the possibility. I turned and walked back toward my house, feeling the wind at my back and understanding fully that even now I could still choose to disappear. Every step was a decision, and by the time I reached my porch, I knew that pretending otherwise was no longer an option. I came back carrying only what made sense: a small toolkit, a portable heater extension cord, and my phone already set to keep the camera recording not pointed at them but at the doorway and the street behind me. When I explained what I was doing, she watched closely. Her posture, straight shoulders set the way someone stands when they have learned to measure risk in seconds. I told her I would not step inside, that I would work from the porch and the threshold, only that the camera would stay on and that she could keep the chain locked the entire time. If she wanted, she nodded once and said that was acceptable, nothing more, nothing less. The child peered around her coat, curious about the heater, and asked if it was loud. I said no, just warm, and he smiled at the word. Warm, like it was a place he could visit. I set the heater near the door, angled inward, and tested it, keeping my hands visible as I worked. She adjusted the chain herself, opening the door only as much as necessary. The wind rushed in and she flinched, then steadied herself and said, "It was okay, go ahead." I knelt and began bracing the frame more carefully, wedging the wood deeper, adding a temporary screw where the grain would hold, without splitting the door. Resisted, then finally settled again. This time with a quieter sound, less complaint, more acceptance. The heater hummed softly, and within minutes the edge of the room nearest the door felt different, not cozy, but survivable. The child pressed his fingers near the gap, watching the air change, and said it was better now. I asked if he could feel the wind still coming through, and he shook his head, serious about the experiment. His mother watched the whole exchange, then surprised me by asking my name. I told her, and she repeated it once to herself, like she was placing it somewhere safe. I asked hers, and she told me without elaboration, just a name, no story. She said thank you again, and I could tell this thank you was different. It was not for generosity, but for respecting the limits she had set that mattered more than anything. I finished tightening the brace and stepped back, showing her the door opening and closing with the chain still on it held. I said it would get them through the night, and she nodded, satisfied enough, not grateful enough to be indebted. The child asked if I had kids, and I said no, not anymore. The words slipped out before I shaped them and hung there heavier than the cold. She did not react. She did not apologize or pry. She simply put a hand on her child's shoulder and asked him to grab his blanket from the couch. He did, and returned immediately, dragging it behind him. Then he asked if the heater could stay on all night. I explained how it worked and showed her the switch and the outlet and where to place it safely. She asked practical questions about cords and distance, and I answered each one slowly, making sure nothing felt rushed when I finished. She said she would turn it off before sleeping and thanked me for explaining. Like she meant it, I stepped back into. The wind then hesitated and said, "I could bring more wood tomorrow if it stayed cold." She said maybe, and that was enough. I turned to go, and that should have been the end, but the child stopped me, with a question asked plainly without pleading, if I lived close enough to hear the door. If it cried again tonight, I said yes, close enough. He nodded and said, "Okay, then you can sleep too." His logic was simple and complete. I did not correct him. I walked home feeling the quiet weight of the camera, still recording the porch light still on. When I reached my door, I did not go inside right away. I stood listening to the storm and thinking about how small the accepted help had been and how large it felt to give it without crossing a line later that night when the wind surged again. My phone buzzed with a notification from the camera at their door. I opened the feed and watched the frame hold the brace steady, the heater light dim, but present. I felt relief. Then something else, a pull to do more that I resisted. Because more had not been asked for, near midnight another alert came. This time from my own porch. The wind had knocked something loose. I went out, fixed it quickly, and as I did, I noticed the street had gone quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when everyone is inside, hoping the night passes without asking anything of them. I looked toward their place and saw the faint glow near the door. Steady and contained, not spilling out into the street that mattered. It meant the help stayed where it belonged, inside their rules. I went back in and tried to sleep, but my mind kept returning to the way she had accepted only what was safe, only what was necessary. Nothing that required trust beyond the hour. I understood then that trust would not arrive all at once, and that if it ever did, it would be earned by repeating the same careful choice over and over. Without asking for credit in the early morning, the wind eased just enough to sound different, and I lay awake knowing the door had held and that for the first time that night my silence had not been the loudest thing in the room. Morning came without ceremony. The storm loosened its grip, but left the street damp and gray. I brought coffee out of habit and stood at the edge of my porch, watching the light change. I told myself I would check the door once more and then be done. That was the agreement I had made with myself when I reached their place. The door was closed properly. The heater was off, just as she had said it would be. I knocked once, not loudly, and stepped back, giving space. When she opened, the chain was still on. Her eyes moved first to my hands, then to my face, and finally to the bag I carried. She asked if something was wrong, and I said no, just wanted to make sure it held. She nodded and unhooked the chain enough to test the door herself. It stayed put. The relief on her face was quick but real. The child appeared behind her, wrapped in the same blanket, and asked if the wind went away. I said it moved on for now, and he accepted that like it was good news but not a promise. I reached into my coat and felt the weight of what I had decided to bring, folded bills, clean and practical. I told myself it would help them get through the week, replace the brace with something better. Buy heat, buy time, and maybe buy an end to this feeling in my chest. I held the envelope out and said it was for supplies, repairs, whatever they needed. I kept my voice even, as if money were just another tool, like the screws in my pocket. She did not take it. She looked at the envelope, then back at me, and shook her head once. Not sharply, not offended. Just firm, I said. It was okay, truly. No strings, and she said, I know, but no. Then she surprised me by explaining calmly that she did not want her child thinking help always came as cash, that it taught the wrong lesson, that people were problems to be solved quickly. I tried to say it was different, that this was safety. And she interrupted gently, saying safety was already handled. She gestured to the door to the brace to. The way the room felt warmer now, she said. They could manage the rest. I felt something tighten in me, not anger, but embarrassment, like I had tried to close a door with the wrong key. The child watched us and asked if the paper was for drawing. She smiled at him and said, Not that paper, but he could use the other one. I had brought, without realizing it, a pad of paper and a pencil rolled into the bag. From some earlier errand, I handed those over, and he sat immediately on the floor near the door, drawing with the seriousness of a job. She apologized for the refusal, and I told her there was nothing to apologize for. But the truth was, I had expected money to do what presents had started, and it had failed quietly. The child hummed as he drew, stopping now and then to ask if a line looked like a door or a window. I answered when he asked and stayed quiet when he did not. She offered coffee, and I declined. Standing where I was not stepping further inside, she respected that without comment. After a few minutes, the child held up the page and said it was done. It showed 3 figures standing in front of a bright rectangle meant to be the door. The figures were simple but clear. One small one, tall one in between, holding nothing but space. She glanced at the drawing and went still, then smiled at him and said it was good, very good, and asked who the tall one was. He looked at me, then back at her and said, The doorman. She did not correct him. She folded the page carefully and placed it on the counter where it would not smudge. I realized then that the money had been a way out for me, a clean ending, a receipt that said the account was settled. Refusing it kept the account open, not in debt but in attention. When I left, she thanked me again for the door and for respecting her answer. I nodded and said, if the brace loosened to call, she said she would consider it, which was her way of leaving room without giving permission. As I walked back, the envelope felt heavier than before. Useless weight I did not want to carry. I tore it open and slid the bills back into my pocket. Resolved not to offer them again unless asked, later that afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and bought a proper strike plate. Longer screws, weather stripping things that did not look like help but worked like it. I did not bring them over. I left them in my trunk, waiting for a request that might never come. That night, I sat alone and took the drawing from where I had photographed it earlier. She had allowed that when I asked, and studied the way the door was drawn brighter than the people, as if light itself were the subject. I thought about how quickly I had tried to simplify a complicated thing, how often money had been my way of avoiding staying, when staying was harder. I put the envelope away and pinned a copy of the drawing near my desk, not as a reminder to give, but as a reminder to wait. The next day passed quietly, and I did not go over. I let the space remain theirs. Late in the evening, my phone buzzed with a message. From an unknown number, the door is still holding. Thank you. Nothing else? No name? No request? I typed back. Glad to hear it stays that way, and then stopped myself and sent nothing more. When I lay down that night, I understood something that felt important. The refusal was not a rejection, it was a boundary, and respecting it was the only way to be allowed near it again. I did not plan to bring them into my house that day. In fact, I told myself I would avoid it, because once a door opens inward, it is harder to control what follows. But the temperature dropped again by evening. Not storm level, just the kind of cold that seeps and lingers. She texted asking if I knew a place nearby where they could wait, while a friend checked a heater issue. I thought of the community center, then remembered it closed early. I thought of my garage before. I thought of my living room, and I told her she could use the space near my garage entrance where the heater worked and cameras covered the area. I added that I would not come in unless asked. She agreed quickly, not gratefully, just practically. When they arrived, I opened the side door and stepped back, letting them enter. First, the garage was clean concrete. Floor-swept shelves labeled everything in its place. A heater mounted high, humming with effort. The child held his hands out to it and laughed softly. When the warmth reached his fingers, she apologized for the intrusion, and I told her it was temporary and meant it. The space smelled faintly of oil and cardboard. Not home, not comfort, just function. They sat on folding chairs, and I stood near the doorway. Not crossing the line, the heater clicked and steadied. I noticed how the child looked around with curiosity. Not judgment. He asked what the boxes were, and I told him storage. He asked what kind, and I said, old things. He nodded as if that explained enough while she checked messages. I busied myself with nothing until the child stood and walked toward a stack of boxes marked winter. He touched the dust with one finger and looked at me asking if he could open one. I hesitated, then said yes. Just that one inside were decorations wrapped in newspaper, a strand of lights tangled, a paper star crushed at the points. The dust was thick enough to draw a line. The child sneezed and laughed. She glanced over, ready to stop him, but I shook my head. Letting it happen, he lifted the paper star carefully and asked what it was. I said a star for a tree. He asked why it was here, and I said, because I put it away a long time ago. He did not ask why. He just held it up to the light and said, it still works. Even if bent, that sentence did something to me. I felt the space contract, as if the cold I had kept here was not from weather but from neglect. She watched my face and said quietly, you do not have to keep this open if it is hard. I told her it was fine, which was true in the narrow sense, but the wider truth was that I had kept this space untouched because warming it would require remembering. I knelt and helped the child wrap the star back in paper. My hands shook a little, which I hid by folding carefully. The heater kicked louder and the concrete lost its bite. She received a message then saying the friend could not come tonight and asked if they could wait a little longer. I said yes and sat on the step near the door, giving them distance. The child asked if the garage was lonely. I told him it was quiet, and he said quiet can be lonely if nothing talks back. I did not know how to answer, so I said sometimes, and he accepted that too. After a while, the heater tripped and went silent. I stood to reset it, cursing under my breath, not at the machine, but at myself for thinking. Function alone was enough when it came back on. I moved one chair closer to the heater without being asked. She noticed and nodded, a small acknowledgement that did not feel like permission, but trust building. By inches, the child picked up a marker from my pocket and drew on the dusty box, a small door with light lines around it. I should have stopped him. I did not. He said it was to help the box see, and I laughed once, surprised by the sound. I realized then that this space had been designed to stay unused. Warmed only enough to protect objects, never enough to invite people. That was the point of it. And also the problem. She checked the time and said they would head back soon. I offered to walk them, and she declined, saying she preferred to keep things simple when they stood to leave. The child looked at the shelves once more and asked if the star would come out again someday. I said maybe, and he said it should, because stars do not like boxes. I carried that sentence with me after they left. I did not lock the side door right away. I sat on the step and watched my breath fog and thought about the rooms upstairs that were warm and untouched. The garage felt different now, not warmer exactly, but disturbed, like a surface broken. She texted later saying they made it home and the heater was holding. I replied, good, and then, without planning, typed, if you need. To wait again, the space is available. She answered, understood. Thank you, no emoji, no softness, just clarity. I went back into the garage and moved the boxes away from the heater, making room. I wiped the dust from the shelf where the star had been and placed it there, unfolded, not lit, not fixed, just present. I realized I had kept warmth from this space because warmth invites use, and use invites memory, and memory invites pain, but keeping it cold had not protected me. It had only preserved the pain intact. That night, I slept poorly, hearing the heater click in my mind like a metronome, marking time I had wasted in rooms that stayed unused because I thought that was control in the morning. I opened the garage again and let the light in, not because anyone was coming, but because I needed to see it as a place that could be entered without apology. It happened without planning, the way most cracks do. She came by in the afternoon to return the extension cord, and the child followed carrying the paper star, folded carefully like it mattered. He handed it back to me and said, "Thank you for letting it breathe." I smiled at that and told him he was welcome. Then he pointed at the shelf where I had placed it unfolded and asked why it was there. Now I told him because it did not belong in a box anymore. He nodded satisfied, then looked at me with the kind of focus children use when they are about to ask something important. "What was his name?" he said, just like that. No lead-up, no warning. His mother inhaled sharply and said, "His name is not our business," but I shook my head gently and said it was okay, because the truth was it had been my business for years. Just one, I kept locked away. I stared at the star for a moment, then said, "Evan," the name sounded strange in my mouth, like a word I had not used aloud in a long time. The child repeated it once softly. "Evan," like he was tasting it. She did not react. She did not apologize or shift closer. She simply waited, which mattered more than any response I had prepared. The child asked how old Evan was, and I said 5. When I last held him, the words landed heavier than I expected. The room seemed to tilt, not dramatically, just enough to notice the child considered this. Then asked if Evan liked stars. I said yes, very much. He liked anything that stayed bright, even when the room was dark. The child smiled and said me too. Then he asked if Evan was cold, and that was the moment the question pierced me. Not because it was cruel, but because it was innocent. I felt my chest tighten and answered honestly. "I do not know." His mother stepped in then and said, "That is enough," and thanked me again for the help and for the space and for the time. She made it clear the conversation was ending without making it awkward or dramatic. The child picked up the star and held it out to me again, then paused and placed it back on the shelf. Instead, he said, "It should stay here because it found you," and I did not know what to do with that sentence, so I said, "Okay." They left soon after, and I stood alone in the garage, staring at the star. The heater hummed, but the warmth felt irrelevant. Now the name echoed Evan, Evan, Evan. Each repetition pulled something loose. Memories I had avoided by keeping rooms cold, by keeping boxes sealed, by answering questions with silence. I remembered the way he used to press his nose to the window at night, counting the lights on the street, and how he would tell me which ones were brave for staying on late. I remembered the sound he made when he slept, a soft whistle on the inhale that I used to listen for as proof he was still there. I remembered the hospital room brighter than it needed to be, and how the machines spoke in numbers I did not understand until it was too late. I had avoided saying his name, because names invite stories, and stories invite blame, and I had carried enough of that to last a lifetime. But hearing a child say it without fear, without history, without expectation, cracked the seal that night. I took the star inside for the first time and set it on the kitchen table, not to decorate, not to honor, just to acknowledge. I cooked something simple and ate standing up, then sat and said the name again quietly. "Evan." It hurt, but it did not break me, which surprised me. I realized that avoiding the name had kept the wound raw, untouched by air the next day. The child came by again with his mother to drop off a thank you note. She wrote it neatly. Brief, practical, appreciative, without debt. Attached, the child asked if the star could come out again tonight. I said yes, and he asked if Evan could see it too. I said maybe, and he accepted that without question, as children do when adults answer honestly after they left. I stood by the window and watched the porch light across the street flick on, then off as someone adjusted it. I thought about the way the child had placed the star back on the shelf, not as a gift, but as a return of something I had lost possession of. I understood then that he had not asked for the name to hurt me. He had asked because names connect people to rooms, and rooms to warmth, and warmth to staying. That night, I slept on the couch near the garage door and dreamed of a small hand pressing against the glass, not asking to come in, just asking if I could see it in the morning. I woke early and went to the shelf and held the star carefully, unfolding the bent points a little at a time. I did not try to fix it completely. Some bends were part of its shape. Now I set it where the light could reach it, and when the sun rose, it caught the edges and scattered thin lines across the wall, like paths I could follow if I chose. I said the name one more time out loud, not to mourn, not to apologize, but to include him in the room. I was finally warming. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere. At once, a thin, unsteady tune drifting through the open space between my garage and the street. Not loud, not practiced, just a child's voice testing notes like steps on ice. He was sitting on the curb swinging his legs while his mother checked her phone. And he was singing to himself, not a song meant to be heard, just something to pass the minutes. The melody was wrong in small ways. The timing slipped. The words wandered, but the rhythm was familiar enough that my body recognized it before my mind did. I froze with my hand on the shelf where the star rested unfolded. The sound reached me and pulled a thread I had tied off years ago. It was a lullaby my wife used to hum when Evan would not sleep, the kind you make up as you go. Because the point is not perfection, it is presence. The child missed a word and replaced it with a hum, and that hum was exactly how she used to end the line when Evan breathed easier. I felt my knees weaken and sat on the step because standing suddenly felt like a lie. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with recognition. The garage seemed to recede, the walls farther away. The heater louder, the air thinner. The child kept singing. Unaware, his mother glanced up, ready to hush him, and I shook my head once, telling her silently, "Not to." She watched me, then looked back at him and let him finish when he stopped. He smiled at nothing and asked if I liked it. I tried to answer, but my voice failed. The sound had done what questions could not. It bypassed my defenses and went straight to the place I kept sealed. I did not sob dramatically. There was no collapse that others could see. I simply sat and let the tears come quietly, because there was no one there to perform, for his mother stayed where she was not approaching, not retreating, giving me space without abandonment, which was a gift. The child walked over and sat beside me close enough to share warmth but not touch. He asked if the song was sad. I said it was old. He said old songs know where to go, and I nodded because that felt true. My breath hitched once and then again, and the rhythm of it reminded me of nights counting Evan's breaths, listening for the whistle, waiting for it to settle. The sound of this child's voice had broken the control. I relied on the control that kept me useful and distant, and it broke it safely because the people present did not demand anything from the break. When I could speak again, I said thank you, and the child said, "You are welcome," like that was the whole exchange. His mother asked if they should go, and I said, "No, stay, if you want." The words surprised me because they were not careful, they were honest. She weighed them, then nodded, and they stayed. The heater hummed, the star caught the light, and the garage felt less like a threshold and more like a room where something could happen. I told them, then, not everything, not the long version, just enough, I said. The song reminded me of my son and that he was gone. I did not explain how or why, and they did not ask. The child listened and then asked if Evan liked being sung to. I said yes, and he said, "Good, because songs help you find people even when they are not there." I could not argue with that logic. It did not ask me to believe anything. It asked me to accept that sound carries memory, and memory carries people. The child stood and sang. One more line softly, then stopped on his own. His mother said it was time, and I agreed. They gathered their things, and before leaving, the child pointed at the star and asked if it could come outside, just for a minute. I hesitated, then said yes. He carried it carefully, holding it up so the light hit it, and laughed when the points scattered brightness on the concrete. He gave it back and said, "It works." She thanked me again and they left, and I sat alone with the echo of the song still vibrating in my chest. The sound had broken me, but not in the way I feared. It did not shatter me into pieces. It split a seam that needed air. I realized control had kept me functioning, but it had also kept me frozen. The break let warmth move. Where it had been blocked that night, I did not turn off the porch light. I left it on and sat by the window, listening to the street until sleep came. In short, shallow stretches, each time I woke, the melody returned softer, less sharp, more like a companion in the morning. My phone buzzed with a message from her asking if the heater was okay. I replied yes, and then added, "Thank you for letting him sing," she answered. "He sings when he feels safe." That sentence landed gently and stayed. I understood then that the sound had not only broken me, it had connected me to a responsibility, not to fix, not to rescue, but to be present when presence was asked for the control. I lost was replaced by something steadier, a willingness to stay with discomfort without closing doors or turning off lights. I went to the shelf and touched the star, and for the first time since Evan, I hummed the melody under my breath, not to summon the past, but to acknowledge it. The sound did not hurt this time. It held. Night fell without ceremony, the way it does when a storm has already taken its drama with it, leaving quiet that feels heavier than noise. They came back after dinner because the heater at their place kept tripping, and she asked if they could sit for a bit. While it cooled, I said yes without adding conditions, and that was new. I unlocked the side door and stepped back again, but this time I stayed in the room, not hovering, not retreating, simply present. We sat on opposite sides of the garage with the heater between us like a neutral witness. The child drew on scrap paper while she scrolled for updates on repair services. The star sat on the shelf catching the light in small, calm flashes. After a while, the child stood and placed his drawing on the floor between us. It showed a door with light lines around it and 3 figures outside. One, tall one, small one, smaller. I knew who he meant. Without asking, he said, "This is for when it gets dark, so you remember where to stand." Something in me loosened, and I realized hiding had not been about avoiding pain. It had been about avoiding responsibility for connection. I took a breath and spoke without preparing, without editing. I told them the short truth that I had not answered a knock once a long time ago, that I had turned away because I was afraid of what opening would cost me, I said. My son got sick, and I chose work and routine over sitting in the room when he needed me most. I did not dramatize it. I did not ask forgiveness. I simply said, I was not there enough, and then I stopped speaking. The heater clicked. The child colored quietly. She did not rush to fill the space. She asked one question only. What did you do after? And I answered honestly. I built walls that looked like order and called it survival. The child looked up then and said, Did it work? I said it kept me standing, but it did not keep me warm. He nodded, like that was the expected result. Then he pushed the drawing closer to me and said, You can stand here now, pointing to the tall figure near the light. The words Santa did not come from him. Yet the meaning did the same work. I felt something settle, not relief exactly, but alignment, like my actions and my understanding were finally facing the same direction. She watched me carefully, then said, Thank you for telling us, and did not add anything else. The night moved on without a climax. No tears, no speeches, just a steady sense of being seen without being judged. Later, when she asked if they should head back, I said they could stay until the heater at their place was safe again. She checked the time and agreed. The child curled up on a folded jacket and fell asleep quickly, trusting the space without testing it. I sat awake, listening to his breathing, and noticed the faint whistle on the inhale, the same sound that used to anchor my nights. Years ago. It did not stab. This time, it guided. I did not reach for my phone. I did not check the camera. I stayed where I was when the heater tripped again. I reset it quietly and placed another jacket over the child without touching him. She noticed and nodded once near dawn. She woke him and they prepared to leave. She thanked me and asked if it was okay to text later. I said yes and meant it without qualification. The child hugged the paper star to his chest, then returned it to the shelf like a ritual he had invented and said, See you soon, not asking when, not demanding anything, just stating a future where showing up was assumed after they left. I stood alone and looked at the drawing on the floor. I picked it up and placed it beside the star. Then I did something I had not done before. I unlocked the front door and left it that way while I made coffee. Not because danger had vanished, but because I was done hiding behind locks. As my first response, the night had not fixed anything. Miraculous had not arrived, but something irreversible had happened. I had spoken the truth without turning it into currency, and in doing so, I had stepped into responsibility not to save them, not to redeem myself, but to keep choosing presence when it was offered later that morning. A message came from her saying the heater held and thanking me. Again, I replied, You are welcome, and then added, If you need help later today, I am around. She responded understood, and that was enough. The night I stopped hiding did not end with applause. It ended with morning light on a concrete floor and the quiet knowledge that I would not pretend neutrality again when a door asked to be answered. Morning did not arrive with a lesson or a promise. It arrived with gray light and a list of practical problems. The heater needed a permanent fix, the door frame still leaked along the bottom edge, and the lock stuck when the temperature dropped. I made coffee and wrote down numbers for local repair services because that was the only honest next step. I texted her asking if she wanted me to call on her behalf or if she preferred to do it herself. She replied she would call, but asked if I could be there when the technician came, not to decide anything, just to be present. I said yes without thinking and noticed how ordinary that felt. The technician arrived mid-afternoon, a tired man with a toolbox and an apologetic smile. He explained the limits of a quick fix and the cost of doing it right. There was no miracle price, no hidden discount, just a range that made sense. She winced slightly, then nodded and asked him to proceed. I did not offer money. I stood by the door and held it steady when he asked for a hand. The child watched with serious focus, like this was a ceremony worth remembering when the work was done. The heater ran without cutting out, and the draft quieted to a whisper. The technician left a receipt and a timeline for a follow-up visit, and that was it. No before and after music. No speech, just a warmer room and fewer reasons to panic. She thanked me again and I shrugged because gratitude was not the point. Reliability was. We sat for a few minutes in the kitchen drinking water. The child traced shapes on the table and asked the technician questions that made him laugh before he left. As the door closed, she looked at the latch, then at me and said, "I hate that I feel safer when someone else is here." I answered, "I do not think safety means being alone." She considered that without agreeing or disagreeing, then said, "If the door sticks again, would it be okay to call you?" That question mattered more than any dramatic reconciliation because it placed me inside a pattern instead of a moment. I said yes and added, "If I do not answer, I will call back." She nodded once and the subject changed to groceries and school schedules and whether the child could keep the paper star on the shelf at my place. I said it could stay where it was and felt a small pride in not turning it into a symbol later that evening. Neighbors drifted by curious about the van and the noise. I answered simple questions and pointed them toward the technician for future work. One man asked if I was starting a side business and I said no, just helping coordinate a repair. The truth felt sturdy enough without embellishment. Over the next few days, nothing remarkable happened, which was the point. I stopped by once to drop off a weather strip the technician recommended and left it by the door without knocking. She texted thanks and installed it herself. The child sent a photo of the finished edge with a thumbs-up sticker. I replied, "Looks good," and meant the craft and the effort more than the result. One night, the power flickered, and the child called to report the heater held. We celebrated by doing nothing else. The camera on my porch caught snow drifting sideways, and I did not turn the light off out of superstition, but out of habit. The habit had changed at the end of the week. The follow-up visit finished the job, and the technician tested the system twice before signing off. There was relief, but not release. No one hugged, no one cried. She paid the balance and folded the receipt into a folder labeled house. Like that word had weight now as they were leaving. She paused at my door and said something careful. "I am not looking for anyone to fix us. I am just trying to make it steady," I said. "I know," and added, "I am not trying to be anything other than useful when asked." She smiled, and that was enough. Days passed, and showing up remained small and unremarkable. A ride to pick up parts, a call to confirm appointments, a check and text during another cold snap. The child stopped asking if I was afraid at night and started asking, "What day?" It was because routine had returned one evening as we stood on opposite sides of the doorway. She said, "I want to keep boundaries clear. That matters to me." I said it matters to me too, and we agreed on times and reasons, like adults building something that could hold the absence of fantasy. Felt like respect. Nothing miraculous happened, and that was the miracle. If there is one, the fear receded because the work continued. The heater ran because someone tightened bolts and replaced a relay. The door held because wood met metal. The trust formed because I did what I said I would do and did not do what I had not been asked to do. When the child waved goodbye, that night he said, "See you later. Not tonight," and I answered later. Then I locked my door and left the porch light on. Not as a beacon, not as penance, just as a default state. The world did not reward me, the sky did not part, but the ordinary rhythm returned, and with it a sense that belonging is earned by repetition, not declared by intention. Showing up did not feel heroic. It felt scheduled, like brushing teeth or checking the weather, and that was how I knew it was real, the first time it happened without a crisis attached. She texted to ask if I could watch the child for 20 minutes while she ran to the pharmacy because the line at school pickup had run long. I checked my calendar, saw nothing sacred, and replied, "Yes." I stood on the porch when they arrived, and the child stepped inside without hesitation, not rushing, not clinging, just moving as if the path had been walked before. He set his backpack down in the same spot he always chose and asked if he could finish a drawing he had started earlier. I said yes and made tea that tasted like leaves and patience. When she returned, 20 minutes became 30, then 40. Not because she lingered, but because traffic did. What traffic does? She apologized and I waved it off because time had stopped feeling transactional. That was the moment I noticed the habit forming not just mine, but ours. Days layered themselves like that rides offered and accepted without ceremony. Texts exchanged that did not ask for proof of worth, only confirmation of availability. I showed up to hold a ladder while a neighbor replaced a light because once you are visible, people ask, and when you answer, yes, the asking spreads. She showed up with soup one night after I mentioned a cold and left it on the step because boundaries still mattered. The child started narrating his days as if I were part of the background noise of safety. Not the headline he talked about a spelling test and a class pet and a rumor that it might snow again. He stopped asking why I helped and started asking when I would be back, which felt like a test I passed by, answering honestly. Sometimes tomorrow, sometimes next week, sometimes I do not know yet. Consistency did not require proximity, it required truth. Neighbors noticed the pattern and named it quietly. The man across the street said, "It was good to see someone take responsibility." Without taking over, a woman down the block asked if I could help her coordinate repairs for an elderly tenant. And I did because the system I had learned was portable. I shared numbers, schedules, checklists. The habit spread outward like warmth does when a room finally holds heat. One evening, the child called me by my first name without the careful pause he used before, and the sound landed soft and solid. She noticed and watched my face for reaction. I smiled and kept my voice even because names should arrive when they are ready, not when they are demanded. Weeks turned and the season loosened its grip. The heater ran without complaint, the door closed cleanly and stayed closed. We marked nothing with a ceremony. The absence of emergency was celebration enough. When school held a community day, she asked if I would come because there would be folding tables and a raffle and not enough hands. I went and carried boxes and stapled flyers and stood in the cold while kids sang off key. The child waved from the risers and searched for my face. After the song ended, I clapped, because clapping is what you do when someone shows courage by standing up. The habit matured into something like belonging. Not because anyone declared it, but because the schedule assumed it. She never asked me to stay the night, and I never offered, not because fear lingered, but because respect had a shape, and we knew it together. One late afternoon, a storm threatened, and the memory of that first night flickered at the edges. She texted to say, the weather looked rough, and I replied, I am around, if needed. That was all the exchange required. When the wind rose, it did not knock the power out, and nothing rattled. But I still checked in. The habit of care had outlived the trigger that birthed it. The child began leaving small notes on my table, drawings of houses with lights on, doors closed properly, figures standing near but not touching. One note said, "Thanks for coming back," which startled me because I had not realized leaving had been an option worth naming later. She admitted she had watched for patterns before trusting the habit had passed her test. Not because I was perfect, but because I was predictable in the right ways. The community noticed too. A block meeting formed around repairs and safety, and I helped facilitate, not lead. I brought the same rules that worked before presence. First, money. Last, boundaries. Clear promises. Small and kept the porch light on became a running joke. Someone said it was my signature, and I laughed because symbols are lighter when they are shared without gravity. One evening after homework, the child asked if habits could disappear. I said, habits fade if you stop feeding them. He asked if hours would fade, and I answered only if we stopped showing up. He nodded satisfied and returned to his drawing. She watched me then and said, "Thank you for not trying to be more than this," I replied. "Thank you for letting this be enough." The habit held through minor disagreements, a missed call, a rescheduled visit we repaired with words. Not gifts, the trust did not shatter because it had been built with joints that flexed as the year turned. The porch light stayed on, and people learned it meant availability, not obligation. One night, the child asked why my door was always unlocked during the day, and I said, because I live on a street that knows my name. Now he smiled and said, okay, and that felt like the last piece clicking into place. Not a miracle, not a vow, just a rhythm that kept time. The door I no longer lock did not become a symbol overnight. It became a practice, the kind that sneaks up on you while you are busy doing ordinary things like taking out the trash or watering a plant. The lock still worked. I had not removed it or thrown it away. I simply stopped turning it during the day because the street had learned my footsteps and I had learned its rhythms. Mornings carried the sound of school backpacks and coffee cups. Evenings held the scrape of keys and tired laughter, and the porch light stayed on. Not as an invitation, but as a promise that presence could be found without performance. The child grew taller and quieter in the way children do when they feel safe enough to conserve words. She grew steadier too, moving through her days with the confidence of someone who knows where help lives, even if she hopes not to need it. Our habit matured into a lattice that held without squeezing. We shared holidays without claiming them, a plate exchanged here, a chair pulled up there, attended a winter concert and clapped for songs that missed their notes. She hosted a simple dinner and asked nothing more than that I arrive on time. The community repair day returned, and this time I did not organize it alone. Neighbors brought lists and tools and patience, and the work moved faster because ownership had shifted from me to us. I watched the child hand a screwdriver to a neighbor like a right and felt the quiet satisfaction of redundancy, which is another word for resilience. When systems do not depend on one person, they endure. A year after the storm, we marked nothing with speeches. Instead, we fixed a hinge together because weather does not ask permission to return. The child held the flashlight and narrated the task like a story she had memorized, and I realized that repair had become a language. She spoke fluently. Later, she asked why the door mattered so much, and I told her that doors decide who gets to feel safe. She thought about it and said, then we should fix all of them, which is how children translate values into plans. She asked if doors ever get tired, and I said they do if they are slammed and neglected. She nodded and said, then we will be gentle. I watched her carry that sentence into other rooms, into other days. She never asked to call me anything other than my name, and that was enough. Names are containers, and ours fit the contents. We shared a silence one afternoon that felt like completion. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything said would have been extra. The porch light hummed and the lock stayed still. A neighbor stopped by to drop off mail that had wandered and commented on the door being open. I said it closes when it needs to, and that answer seemed to satisfy him because people recognize boundaries when they are honest. The child left a note on my table before a school trip that said we will be back soon. Keep the light on, and I did because rituals teach children that absence does not equal abandonment. She returned with stories and dust on her shoes and resumed her place in the rhythm without ceremony. Later that winter, the power flickered and went out for a moment long enough to remind us of the past. She texted to check in, and I replied, I am here. The light came back on and the door remained unlocked because fear no longer drove the policy we had replaced. Panic with protocol and protocol with trust, which is how safety grows roots. I noticed something else too. My own life had widened in small, sturdy ways. I slept better because my days carried purpose. I worked with a clarity that surprised colleagues because my energy was no longer consumed by avoidance. I stopped rehearsing excuses and started planning returns. The habit of showing up had reprogrammed my sense of worth away from performance toward reliability. The final evening of the year arrived without drama. The street gathered for a modest countdown, and we stood near each other, not touching, not separate, watching breath turn to cloud when midnight came. The child tugged my sleeve and asked if the door would stay open next year. I told her the truth, that doors stay open as long as people keep them safe together. She smiled and said, then we will keep doing that. And the sentence felt like a vow, even though no one had asked for one. The night settled, the porch light glowed, and the lock rested unused, not because danger had vanished, but because belonging had been earned slowly, carefully, and without spectacle. Some doors are fixed, some are opened, mine did both. If you stayed with me until this moment, it means something in this story touched a place you do not usually hand over easily, and I want to honor that by not rushing you out of it because stories like this are not meant to end cleanly, they are meant to linger, the way a porch light stays on long after the house has gone quiet. Maybe you recognized yourself in the hesitation in the moment when the doorbell rang and the instinct was to stay still, not because you are cruel, but because you are tired. Maybe you have learned to protect yourself by keeping the lights low and the doors locked and the heart carefully managed. And maybe you know what it feels like to replay a single decision over and over, wondering who you might have been if you had answered differently. This story is not here to judge you. It is here to sit beside you and say that change rarely comes from grand promises or sudden bravery. It comes from showing up again the next morning and the one after that. It comes from choosing presence over performance and consistency over rescue. For many of us, especially those who have lived long enough to collect loss and disappointment, the idea of family has become complicated. We have seen how fragile it can be, how easily it breaks, how often it asks more than it gives. This story offers a quieter truth that family is sometimes not what you are born into, but what you practice. Family can be a habit, a light left on a door, checked and repaired, a name spoken gently instead of avoided. It can be the courage to stay, even when there is nothing left to prove. If you have ever felt invisible or unnecessary or unsure whether your small actions mattered, this story is a reminder that they do. The world does not change because of speeches. It changes because someone decided to return, because someone decided to keep the light on, because someone decided that silence would no longer be their answer. And if you are watching this and thinking about a door you did not open or a call you did not return or a moment you wish you could redo, know this. You are not out of time. You are not disqualified by past hesitation. You are allowed to learn. You are allowed to repair. You are allowed to belong. This channel exists for people who understand that truth. People who know that kindness does not have to be loud to be real, that healing is slow and that redemption is earned through repetition, not declarations. Every story you will find here is built on that same promise. No miracles, no shortcuts, no perfect heroes, just ordinary people choosing to do one thing differently and then choosing it again. If this story made you pause, if it made you breathe a little slower, or think a little deeper, then you are exactly who this space was created for. Subscribing is not about supporting a channel. It is about choosing to stay in this kind of storytelling, choosing stories that respect your intelligence, your experience, and your time. Stories that do not rush you or manipulate you, but walk with you at a human pace. And if you feel comfortable, share in the comments what stayed with you most, or simply leave a light emoji to say you were here. That is enough. This community grows the same way the story did through small signals repeated over time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying, and thank you for being the kind of person who understands that some doors are fixed, some are opened, and some are kept open because someone finally learned how much that matters.